Hi everyone, welcome to welfordWEAVES. My name is Rachel and I can be found on Instagram as Woolen Spinning and on Ravelry as Welford Pearls. I want to welcome you to this place. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you find something here that is helpful. On the Woolen Spinning podcast, our sort of regular podcast here on YouTube, we talk a lot about knitting and spinning. And of course, if we start adding in a whole bunch of other things that I want to talk about, the shows just get longer and longer and longer, and that becomes a lot. The live streams will turn into like 2 or 3 hours. So I thought that welfordWEAVES would be a really great place for me to talk about what I'm doing at the loom and some of the things that I'm learning and some of the things that I'm thinking about without sort of clogging up the podcast anymore. So I hope that there is something here that is helpful to you, and I want you to know that you are welcome here and welcome in this place. If you're a new viewer and you're just checking out the podcast and the show for the first time, thank you so much for checking it out. And if you don't mind taking a moment, everyone, to hit the like and the subscribe button, I would really appreciate that. So thank you so much. So I wanted to chat with you today about my Overshot Sampler. I've been working on this over the last number of weeks. I started this quite a while ago, and I've just been slowly working on it steadily in the evenings when I get a chance to sit down. And I sort of have ended up with this stack of samples and all of these little bits and pieces, and I thought that I would share them with you here today. So the Overshot Sampler comes from Patti Graver's book, The Next Steps in Weaving. This book was recommended to me by a friend quite a number of years ago, and she basically said to me, weave everything in here and then you'll basically have a really good understanding of pretty much every weave structure that you'll come across in your weaving lifetime. And it was kind of with the caveat that, if you want to be able to follow a pattern and look at like Handweaving magazine and all of their previous patterns and whatnot that they've published over the years, look at back issues and current issues and all that kind of stuff, you'll be able to sort of use your detective skills and figure it out after you work through a book like this. Maybe not this one specifically, but a book like this. And I think that the genius of a book like this is it just kind of gives you all of the main weave structures in one place. It runs you through twill, it runs you through overshot, it runs you through summer and winter, and it gives you just a really good sort of general understanding of a lot of this stuff. And that's really helpful for a beginning weaver who's looking to kind of go to the next step and get to the next place in their weaving journey. So in the Overshot section is the Overshot Sampler. So she gives you a draft and she gives you a pattern, and I don't know what just dropped out of there. I have no idea what that was. And you are able to sort of weave off all of these samples, and it results in basically understanding the basics of Overshot, how it works, why it works, and what some of the general guiding principles of Overshot are. And if you've never woven Overshot before, and you're reading through this, you're sort of left, or at least I was left with this feeling of I was a bit confused. I was sort of like, okay, I'm just going to do this thing. I'm going to take a leap of faith. I'm going to wind my warp, thread my loom, and slay my reed, and just kind of on a wing and a prayer and see what happens. And everything worked out. So the draft that Patti uses for the Overshot Sampler actually comes from a weaver's pattern book by Marguerite Porter Davison. And it actually took me a few minutes to find this. I was flipping through and I couldn't find it, but I did finally find it. And in Patti Graver's book, she calls it the Star of Bethlehem. And here it is here in her book. And these are what Marguerite calls the larger Overshot designs. And she has a section in here that are all patterns that are smaller Overshot designs as well. So the smaller Overshot designs sort of look like this. You can see that they're just smaller tiles made up. And then of course the larger Overshot designs are like the one that Patti Graver took, which is this one here for the Overshot Sampler. So what I find really interesting about this is if you look down here, one of them is woven I think that one of them is woven in star fashion and the other one is woven in rose fashion. And so they're woven sort of as opposites, which is really pretty. When you weave star fashion, it's more pointed, it's more square, and rose fashion is often rounder and it looks rounder. That was how a local weaver explained it to me, and I found it really helpful to sort of understand what the difference is and why you might want one over the other. In old weaving textbooks and old books, if you can find them and if you have access to them, there are examples of, you know, a star woven star fashion, and then and woven as drawn in, and then the same pattern woven in rose fashion, and you can see the roses and you can see the roundness of the pattern, and you can see the how different they are and yet how similar. And I found that really helpful to start to understand some of this stuff, because some of these nuances about like things like overshot, if you don't do it all the time, you haven't read about it, you maybe haven't been in a studio or a school space where you're being taught this stuff, it's really confusing. And so slowly piecing it all together and actually doing it at the loom is really, really helpful, and it helps you to kind of get up and on your way. And that's certainly what I found. So Overshot is a twill derivative, and it's a repetitive sequence of twill blocks. So we're no longer thinking about twill in terms of like individual shafts. So 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 1. Now we're thinking about it in terms of blocks. So the shafts 1 and 2 become A block, and shafts 2 and 3 become B block. 3 and 4 on your third treadle become C block, and 4 and 1 on your fourth treadle become D block, and it becomes the way of explaining it. And I found it really helpful to think in terms of blocks. As soon as I made that mental shift in my brain that these are now blocks, A, B, C, D, capital A, B, C, D, it was much more easy to understand what it was that I was trying to achieve. And as I started to draft out my own patterns, which we'll talk about another time because they're actually still on the loom, and do my own designs and play with that particular threading and just starting to change the treadling sequence to get different effects and different patterns, as long as I continued to think in blocks, it became very intuitive, and that was really, really helpful. The other thing to know is that your the last thread of your current block that you're on is the first thread of the next block. So the overshot blocks overlap, which is something that is really helpful to know, because if you're on B block and you just treadled B block, you can only go to A or C, because either your number 2 thread is going to overlap with A, 1, 2, or it's going to overlap with C block. Because your third number 3 is going to overlap with 3, 4. So you know that you can only go one of two directions. You're not going to go from B block to D block unless you're weaving on opposites, which we'll talk about later. So I found that really helpful. And then finally, one of the things that I found really, really helpful was a couple of the tips and tricks that came up when I was learning how to place my weft and how to place both of the yarns in the fabric, and that was really helpful. So we'll talk about that next. So this was my very, very first overshot block that I ever wove, and you can see that there's some errors in here and there's some errors up here. I missed a couple of blocks. I missed some blocks in here because they didn't make that really nice transition, but this was really fun. I used the yarns that were called for in the pattern as a place to start to understand how this all works. So it is 10-2 mercerized cotton for your plain weave ground, and 3-2 mercerized cotton for the pattern weft. So the 10-2 cotton is set at 20 ends per inch, and it's woven at 20 picks per inch. So the way that I envisioned this, and because I'm very visual, I found that a really great way of understanding this was envision your plain weave tea towels that you wove when you were first starting, or your plain weave scarf that you wove on your rigid heddle when you were first learning, or maybe a blanket that you did that's just plain weave. Imagine taking that plain weave, and in between each of your picks that you wove, that you put a different yarn that's using a different set of treadles in between each of your plain weave picks. And that was sort of, it gave me that image of like, okay, if I took my plain weave towel and I superimposed over top of it a pattern weft that was different, it just gave me that understanding of like, what is overshot? Like, what is it? That's what it is. So you tie up your plain weave treadles on your right hand furthermost treadles that you have. For me, I had 6 treadles because I had my A, B, C, D block. And then on the right hand side, my last 2 treadles, 5 and 6, I had my my plain weave. So on the 5th treadle was tied up 1, 3. And on my 6th treadle was tied up 2, 4. And so whenever the shuttle was on the far right hand side, I knew that I had to treadle my number 6 treadle because that was on the far right hand side. And when my plain weave shuttle was on my left hand side and I needed to throw it back to the other side, I knew that I needed to use treadle number 5 because that was closest to my left hand side. And that works for pretty much all of it. The other thing that I had to learn was how to reverse the pattern. So I got halfway through this one. This is also woven as drawn in. So this is woven in star fashion. As I got up to the end of the first repeat, as she had written it in the book, I had to figure out how to keep going. And so here you can see that I made a mistake where I started on, I reversed, I turned. Rather than continuing on, I needed to actually continue this way to begin building the point, and instead I went back out. So I turned, and that was just figuring out like where in the draft I was and where my treadling sequence was to figure out like where are these turning blocks and how do they work. So this was my second sample, and you can see I made a mistake down here as well. Where I got mixed up and I missed a few blocks in there, and I think I jumped is actually what I did, which wasn't right, and I learned because that's the whole point. So then from there, because I kind of figured it out by the end of that sample, I did it again. And in these next couple of samples, what I was really concerned about was my balanced weave. Was I weaving a 50-50 balanced weave? So when you talk about a balanced weave and overshot, you're not paying attention to your pattern yarn, your weft pattern yarn. So that's the dark blue in this case. We're only looking at the white, at the 10-2 cotton. So the 10-2 cotton was the same in the warp and the weft, and it was set at 20 ends per inch, and I wanted 20 picks per inch going up the fabric. And at first, no matter what I did, I could not pack 20 picks per inch in a 1-inch length. It just, no matter what I did, I was always a few short, 17, and then I got it to 18, and then 19, and then I was back to 17. And part of that, and I talked to Erica of weaveolution.com about this, the 3-2 cotton doesn't pack down really nicely like a squishy, airy wool would. So that was definitely part of it. And the 3-2 cotton was what was called for in the pattern. So I kind of wanted to start there and then build from there. But because of that, it was really hard to get that 20 ends and 20 picks. So after reading several sources and talking to a couple of people, mostly the written resources was what really helped. Mary Black's New Key to Weaving, Harriet Tidball's 1961 drafting and what's it called? Drafting, the Handweaver's book. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's Harriet Tidball from 1961. Another book that was really helpful was Helen Bress's book, the Weaving book. What else was I using? There's a couple others. And what they said again and again was give yourself enough weft yarn to pack down. And so I was sort of bubbling it over, thinking that that would give me enough weft yarn. So I would bubble it over the 10-2 cotton, beat, change, beat her back. And it just wasn't quite enough yarn in the weft. And so I started beating and, I started throwing the shuttle and leaving a 45-degree angle. And then beat, change, beat her back. And that gave me the weft yarn that I needed to be able to beat it down and get it packed to 20 picks per inch, and that's what gave me a 50-50 balanced weave. So this is a 50-50 balanced weave, even after washing and finishing. So, and then I wove it again. So that's another little sample. Again, going for that balanced 50-50. And then I decided to start playing with some of the other stuff that was in the book. And so this is woven shadow fashion. So if you look, there are some mistakes in here, so please don't look too closely. But with shadow fashion, we're actually taking our pattern yarn and it now weaves our plain weave background. And our plain weave that we were using prior that matches our warp is now our pattern yarn. And that's what gives you this absolutely beautiful effect of shadow. And what I really like about it is because of the mercerized cotton, it's got this like sheen to it. It's really elegant. I think it's really elegant. And even with some of these mistakes down here that I made, I could see the potential of this. This is not shadow weave. This is woven shadow fashion. So we do need to make that, that distinction. I did make a few mistakes and that's okay. But again, this is a 50-50 balanced weave. And here, instead of measuring my plain weave ground, I'm now measuring my pattern to make sure that I'm still getting that 20 ends and 20 picks. But isn't that effective? I love this. I kept getting Mike to get up and come and look as I was weaving through these samples. And he's like, do I have to get up again? We put my spring up in our bedroom. And the reason is because our master bedroom in this house, the way that it's laid out, it's ridiculously big. It's foolish. And we've never used the one side of our room. And so even though we've kind of got this space, we didn't really know what to do with it. But because the spring is quite quiet, I can weave on it in the evening when the kids are falling asleep and it doesn't bother them. They can hear it, but they don't seem to be bothered by it. And so I can weave off one of these samples, couple of these samples in an evening in about half an hour, 20 minutes. And you feel that sense of accomplishment and it's really lovely. So this one, I haven't trimmed my ends off of it yet, but this is where you actually, if you notice in the hem stitching, there's no border this time. So all of my other samples have like this border. This one has no border. And I just started off straight with the 3/2 cotton. And the reason for that is because you dump the plain weave yarn itself. So there's no longer any 10-2 ground. And instead, you're weaving both your pattern pick and your plain weave with the thicker pattern yarn. And that's what gives you this. And I've made tons of mistakes, so please don't look too closely, but you can see in the middle here, you can see the pattern emerging. And basically what happens is you weave your A block and then a pick of plain weave, and then your B block and a pick of your plain weave, and your C block and a pick of your plain weave. And it's all done with one shuttle and one yarn. So that's what gives you that effect. Now the reason for these floats up here and down here and these mistakes down here is because I wove the wrong plain weave pick. So I maybe used treadle 5 when I should have used treadle 6 and vice versa. And that's what results in these floats. And the reason for that is because there's nothing to pin those floats down in that true plain weave 1 and 3 on 2 and 4 to pin them down. And so what ends up happening is you get these floats. So as soon as I had woven past this section, I realized what I had done and I literally started again. Because what's the point of trying to go back and figure it out when it's just a learning tool? And it also gives me something to show you guys, to give you an example of like, that's what it looks like when you treadle the wrong treadle of your plain weave. It looks like the float. And as soon as I fixed that, it went away. So very cool. Almost kind of a little bit like shadow fashion, but it elongates the pattern. Because if you notice in the section that I did have it like nailed and I was doing it properly and I didn't make any mistakes. And I would highly recommend, if you're gonna do this, like just take the time to write it out so that you know you can follow and what you're doing. But you can see how it elongates the star motif. So if you look at what it looks like woven, in the traditional sense, and how much shorter those stars are compared to what they're like when you're weaving a pick of the overshot and then a pick of your plain weave. You can see how it just elongates the pattern. You literally have more yarn in between, right? Your 10-2 cotton, the idea is that your smaller yarn, your plain weave ground, anchors the fabric and goes almost sort of disappears into the background, so that what you see is the pattern laying over top, those shots of yarn over top. So I abandoned the 3-2 cotton, especially after my conversation with Erica, because I was like, I just don't love this cotton in the warp, sorry, in the weft. And I decided to pull out, I've got a stash full of wool yarn, and I matched the wraps per inch of the 3-2 under a slight amount of tension, under a little bit of a tension that you would expect in your weft as you're weaving. And it was 16 wraps per inch. And so I went through my stash and I pulled out all of the yarns that matched, that were kind of like yarn ends and balls of yarn that I had sort of abandoned. And some of them were a little bit thicker and some of them were a little bit thinner, but they were all roughly 16 wraps per inch. And this is woven, it's woven flame point. And with flame point, you choose 4 colors and you weave each shuttle once. So you've got 4 colors. It works really well if you have like a fade or a set of colors that really work well together. And it sort of goes in repeats all the way up. It's absolutely beautiful. Google flame point overshot and you'll see some amazing stuff. And you don't weave your plain weave ground. I did with this because I hadn't woven with my hand spun before, and I wanted to see what would happen with my gauge. This is a 50-50 plain weave, and you can see that by adding the plain weave ground to the fabric, it actually elongates the flame point slightly. It makes it a little bit fuller, whereas if it was just flame point, it would be packed down a little bit more, and you wouldn't have these tabby blocks in here, and you certainly wouldn't have the half tones in there that are a little bit of the plain weave ground and a little bit of the weft pattern. You would only have the blocks, so it would look different, but it gives you the idea of what flame point would look like. And it was nice not having to juggle 4 shuttles. I only juggled 2 because, of course, the Cheviot is a self-striping yarn, so it gives you sort of this effect of like a mock flame point, but it's not really. It's more like just blocks. So because I loved that sample so much, I decided to do a sample of just blocks. So this is just blocks. And so what just blocks is where you're just weaving blocks. And Mary Black actually talks about in A New Key to Weaving to really spend some time at your loom learning how overshot works and the directions that you can go, because that's how you learn how to read your weaving too, right? If you've just woven B block and you've just done, say, 4 picks of B block, and you don't know where to go next, you either go to A block or you go to C block. So what does that look like if you go in either direction? Does A block result in a turn, or does C block result in more pattern evolving, or does C block turn and A block results in more pattern evolving? So learning that stuff is really helpful. So this is just blocks. This is A, B, C, and then I went to B, C, D, C, D, A, D, A, B, A, B, C, and it starts again. And you get this gorgeous kind of, I think they look like Christmas trees. I think this woven in Christmas colors, like a gorgeous red or a gorgeous green. Actually, a gorgeous green would work really, really well, and you could put it against a gold background, or if you want that really high contrast, you could do a red background if you want it to like scream Christmas, or you could do teal on gold, or that gorgeous kind of blue that people use at Christmas with the gold or the silver. You could get some metallic yarn. I mean, the options are unbelievable. But to me, this really looks like trees, and I think you could really like play with that and bring that out and make this into like a table runner. You could use it for fabric to make stockings. I mean, the options are unbelievable. And what I love about this one is you can see all the halftones in there, so you can see those halftones coming through, and that really helps you to understand like what is a block look like, what does a plain weave block look like, and then what's a halftone. So you can really start to understand what those look like and start to identify it in the fabric. So this was definitely one of my most favorite samples. I'd say those two. And so that really inspired me to keep on going. So this is another, this is woven as drawn in, so it's treadled as it is threaded. Again, we're back to the Star of Bethlehem, just sort of, you know, woven per pattern. And this is Nest Fiber Arts, Fiber Studio, Jen's colorways. And this was the Fiddlesticks colorway that she did quite a number of years ago now. I think it was like 2014 or 2015, maybe even a bit earlier than that. And we used this yarn for the book for Unbraided, me and Katrina, when we wrote that. And this was one of the self-striping colorways that we did. It was chain plied, 3-ply. And you can see how that round yarn, it just really makes the pattern look crisp. It really gives you a lot of definition. The movement of color, my cat, she said this one looked like Christmas. But it was a 50-50 balanced weave, and it just was a really, really nice effect. And the yarn was, you know, it could have been even a little tiny bit loftier, a little bit bigger, but it worked out really, really well. The hand spun was where I started to really get excited about Overshot. Up to that point, I was like, yeah, this is cool. I get it. This is a thing. But then once I started using my hand spun, it was like, oh, this is really cool. This has a lot of options. You could do a lot with this. So, and then of course, because I loved it so much, I had to weave it shadow fashion. So this is the Fiddlesticks colorway, woven shadow fashion, and I had made some mistakes at some point, and I went back and I fixed them so that this sample would be perfect and there wouldn't be mistakes. So if you see a mistake, please don't tell me. What I wanted to share with you with this one was, if you look, you can see these diagonal lines that run through the weaving. Those diagonal, the 45-degree lines. If you're trying to figure out if you're accurate in your weaving and if things are working, check and see if those lines are 45 degrees. I think it's in the New Key to Weaving, Mary Black's book. She talks a lot about the diagonal and using it to help you as you're figuring out your set and whether or not you're on the right track. And then lastly, this is woven on opposites. So this was very different. I did put a header and a footer on this one, but I probably didn't really need to, and I haven't clipped the little tails yet. But this one, you actually get rid of your finer plain weave ground, and you dump that yarn, that shuttle, and you weave 2 different yarns, and you weave them opposite. So when you weave an A, in the other yarn, you weave C block. And then when you weave B block, in your other yarn, you weave D block, and so on. And that's what creates this opposites effect. It's really effective because what ends up happening is it looks like the blocks are happening simultaneously. It reminded me a little bit of like weft. Well, it is a weft faced fabric. It reminded me a little bit of like rep weave. And what I was really sort of surprised by when I pulled it off. So this is a pick of the 3-2 cotton and a pick of the Cheviot. So I wish I had used a slightly higher contrast yarn so that you guys could really see the pattern coming through, because it is a little bit difficult to see. However, the weight of this fabric is like upholstery. Like this would just be awesome on a chair, something that you were reupholstering, a pillow. It would just be awesome as a really nice formal table runner. But this just screams upholstery fabric to me. And I think even woven a little bit, beaten a little bit sharper, a little bit firmer, and using a yarn that was, rather than the cotton and the wool, using 2 wool yarns, I think it would really be quite effective. And then of course the other thing is, because you have your warp threads, the white coming through, I would use a warp that would blend in. So maybe a gray. Gray would work really well. You wouldn't see it, and then you would only see the your pattern, weft pattern yarns, which, I mean, that's what makes these yarns so effective, is they're beautiful. So that has been my foray into Overshot. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was in my records book that I made, and the reason why I made this was because I was having a really hard time keeping track of what I was using for yarns, where my samples were going. I would put my samples away in a box, get them all labeled, and then it was like, yeah, but where's the information that goes with this? So I thought, if I keep this as like a records book and all of the written information, then I know where it is. And so I did weave off, to start with, when I was first getting used to the yarn, I did weave off a sample of the 10-2 cotton. And this is washed and finished, just to see what it would look like and how it would act after the fact. And I couldn't get the set. So the 20 ends per inch, this packed down to more like 22 picks per inch, because it was just a little bit too open. But you want that because, of course, you're going to be putting a weft pattern yarn in between each pick. So I could see immediately why I was getting that unbalanced weave. And of course, what ends up happening is you get a weft faced fabric. You can see that there. It doesn't look balanced. And when I lightened up my beat over here, you get more of a balanced fabric. But that's not necessarily a fabric I would want if I was weaving this as just plain weave for an entire like garment or something. I would adjust my set down to maybe 22 ends and 22 picks. And then these were the yarns. I wanted to keep track of the yarns that I was using so that I could look at them later and see how they compared in terms of how they felt and the grist, the density. And I also made notes about the fiber content, because the Nest Fiber Art Studio, the Fiddlesticks colorway, this yarn here, the red and the green, it was Polworth and Silk 8515, and the purple yarn was actually a Cheviot, 100% Cheviot that I kettle dyed years ago for socks, which were my favorite pair of socks. You guys won't probably remember, but they were my favorite socks, and they accidentally got felted. So the down like wools, they can felt. Keep that in mind. And then I kept a record of the 10-2 cotton and the 3-2 cotton, just so that I would have a record of sort of what these yarns felt like, what they looked like. And then of course I'll document the samples and put them away and number them so that I know what's what. So otherwise, in several years, I think that I will remember, but I won't. And I'll want to talk about it, and I'll want to like run a workshop or do a a presentation, or it's part of our teaching content on wool and spinning, and I won't remember. Right? We think we will, but we won't. So I've really gotten a lot better about keeping records and about writing things down. And some people keep them digitally, and I think that's great too. You have to figure out what works for you, and I probably will eventually migrate over to a digital format as I move on in my Master Weaver. So I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening and for hearing me wax poetic about Overshot. If you have any questions, please post them below in the comment section. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And if you have anything else to add, if you have a tip or a trick, something that you were told when you were first learning how to weave Overshot that would be helpful for others, please share. I'd really like to know, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll share your tips and tricks in future episodes. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining me. And please take a moment to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Until next time, happy weaving. Bye, everyone.